Thank you, everyone, for attending our American Medical Association's Women's History Month webinar titled Fostering Well-Being Through Connection and Communication. My name is Dr. Anita Ravi. I'm a family medicine physician and chair of the AMA Women Physician Section, known as the WPS. I'm also the Young Physician Section representative to the AMA WPS and the CEO and co-founder of the Purple Health Foundation, a nonprofit organization that invests in the physical, mental, and financial health of women and girls who've experienced gender-based violence. The AMA WPS seeks to increase the number and influence of women physicians in leadership roles and advocate for and advance the understanding of women's health issues. All AMA women members are members of the section, and we invite all allies who share our goals to opt in. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Nicole Plenty, who is our WPS delegate and member of the WPS Governing Council. Dr. Plenty is a double board certified OBGYN and maternal fetal medicine specialist, a blogger, a public speaker, and a patient advocate. After a difficult pregnancy, she created Pregnancy Pearls with Dr. Plenty, a vlog and podcast to help patients self-advocate and receive guidance. She's been honored for her work in health policy, mentorship, and health advocacy. She is the proud wife of Reverend Dr. James Anthony Plenty. Together, they have a son, Harrison, very cute, and a fur baby named Sophie. Welcome, Dr. Plenty.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravi. I'm Dr. Nicole Plenty, your moderator for today, and it is an honor to introduce our esteemed presenters. Our first presenter is Dr. Charlene Dewey Riley, is a primary care trained internal medicine physician with 30 years of postgraduate training experience in academic medicine practice and teaching. Her career focus includes cardiovascular disease prevention, opioid education, faculty development, physician wellness, and leadership. After 14 years at Baylor College of Medicine, she is now on Vanderbilt School of Medicine faculty. Dr. Dewey, a diplomat for the American Board of Internal Medicine and National Board of Medical Examiners, holds many academic leadership positions along with her patient care, teaching, and research activities. Dr. Dewey has received many prestigious honors, including the Daniel Litch, MD Award for Exceptional Primary Care while she was chief resident, Fulbright and Jaworski LLP Faculty Development Awards, Baylor College of Medicine's Dean's Recognition Award, 5 Top Doc Awards, and the Gerald Goddard Award for Excellence in Teaching. Our second presenter is Dr. Kemiya Soroff. She completed her medical degree and master's of public health at the University of Utah School of Medicine and her internal medicine residency at Barnes-Jewish Hospital, Washington University School of Medicine. In 2016, Dr. Soroff founded Lodestar, which specializes in trauma-responsive coaching methods for physician colleagues experiencing burnout, trauma, and moral injury. Her background in public health and trauma led her to create a unique trauma-responsive coaching paradigm suited for frontline professionals working in environments of chronic toxic stress, which is probably now. Dr. Soroff serves as an adjunct faculty at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She brings a trauma-informed lens and mitigation approach to institutional justice, equity, and anti-racism work. She is engaged in multiple leadership initiatives and is co-lead faculty and facilitator in the ACGME Equity Matters program. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Drs. Dewey and Sarraf to share insights on ways to encourage physician well-being, improve empathy, and mitigate trauma through connection and communication.
First, I want to thank everybody at the AMA for allowing us to have this event, as well as inviting me to be part of it. I'm going to talk briefly in my 20 minutes about providing healing and promoting hope, healing for women in healthcare. And first, I want to start off with a thank you. And I don't know if you have options to put anything in the chat, but if you do, say thank you to each other. We have gone through a pretty significant last 2 years. We have done wonderful things to sustain ourselves, our families, our work environments, our patient care, the research and the teaching that we do. So I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for all that you have done, all that you are currently doing, and all that you continue to do. And if we don't have options for chat, then just tell each other today, tomorrow, the next day, how much we appreciate each other. My purpose for this session really is to support individual healing, some resilience and empowerment. And what I'll hope is that we will recognize some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we'll reflect on some potential actions for individual healing and enhancing our resilience during this time as we start to heal. So I'll cover a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic first in the introduction, and then we'll go into enhancing healing and resilience before I close. I also want to say that for ground rules, please put your reflective caps on and just think a little bit as I go through the presentation. What is it that you want? What is it that you need? What is it that you can do? All right, so this says, how would you rate your overall health and wellness today? And select one choice: poor, fair, good, or excellent. Okay, so we have about 18% of us at fair, 75% good, but only 7% of us at excellent. So that means we have some place to grow. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk a little bit first about the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I think it's important for us to recognize the challenges and sometimes just to have a place to say, huh, you're right, okay? So needless to say, the pandemic affected all of us, especially healthcare providers, in an individual way. In our own safety, maybe challenging in some of our beliefs, in what we did when we went to work every day, and even how we came home every day and what we did to protect our families and keep ourselves safe. And I personally remember, because I do acute care, I never stopped seeing patients ever during the pandemic, and coming home at the end of the day and thinking, do I have 2 weeks left to live before my children become, orphans, because both of us, my husband and myself, are both physicians. And those are thoughts that many of us had as individuals. And sometimes it was steeped in fear and concern, right? But it was true, and that's how we felt. It also impacted our families greatly. I have 2 children, one was in college, one was in high school. So my youngest spent her whole senior year in her bed on Zoom. And my college student, she was a senior at the time, she came home for spring break and never went back to be able to finish college in person for her senior year. And I can only imagine, because I've had young kids, I know what that was like and how much of a struggle that would have been for women physicians to have childcare issues when their children couldn't take care of themselves at much younger ages, and when daycares closed and things like that, and what level of stress that was on us as individuals and families. But also for our patients had decreased access to care, access to medication sometimes. Fear, stress, anxiety also increased in patients, some still not all that comfortable about coming back into the clinic environment or hospital environment. Patients that I've seen in acute care, when I said I need to admit you to a hospital, said, no, I don't want to be there with all of those COVID patients. So it was huge impact for patients as well. Of course, organizations had to change a lot of things, kind of Johnny on the spot, very quickly to adapt to the situation. They took significant financial hits and even had to make difficult decisions around even furloughing physicians, which is a very unusual event in our lifetimes. And then healthcare, of course, and what we were doing, whether the science was okay, we didn't know. And people lost maybe some faith in us, not knowing exactly what the best answer is in every situation, as long haulers started to develop and the complications of COVID. And then, of course, society that probably already had its own, challenges became almost a divergent kind of society of vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers. And so society took a huge hit, not just in that, but also other political things and social situations that were going on that couldn't be addressed in the usual way. So there is now what we call the pandemic trauma and stress experience, or PTSD, which is a set of expectable expectable individual, family, and community reactions to an enduring global COVID-19 pandemic. And what it actually feels like is a building up of these internal emotions and interpersonal disruptions that result from having to adapt to our neo-normal way of life, one replete with uncertainties and dangers and lacking the freedom of life as it used to be. And of course, for 2 years, we have been in this uncertainty, trying to address, manage, and adopt to our neo way of normal life. So we have options as far as how we start to do things. And in the helplessness realm, I start to think about learned helplessness. And when we get to the point where we become almost paralyzed due to fear or chronic challenges, feeling like we have no control, and we start to sink back into ourselves. And this is a very deep and full conversation that I'm trying to put in a nutshell here. So hopefully I'm not going to do it injustice. But when we get to that point where we almost shut down because we just can't see ourselves going forward, we start to become helpless and hopeless. But what I hope for us is that we start to look at empowerment and thinking about how we empower ourselves so that we're not just surviving, but we're actually thriving. Empowerment means that piece of taking control, taking action, moving us toward a place because we have hope. So I want us to look forward, find our hope, learn from the lessons of the past, adopt to our realities, and find ways to be able to move forward. So this poll asks, are you surviving or in the thriving mode? And you can select surviving, thriving, maybe somewhere in between, or you're not sure. Okay, so for our results, we have about a quarter of us that are in the surviving range, only 3% of us in the thriving range, about 72% of us in that in between, and then 3% of us that are not sure. So that means that we have to find ways to move ourselves forward. So again, keep on your reflective cap as I go through this next session and think about a little bit around how we can heal ourselves. So I start off with this statement. It's called The Ethics of Self-Care, that was written in a book back in 2009. But I have to admit, I talk about it all the time because it says the Medical Academy's primary ethical imperative may be to care for others. But this imperative is meaningless if it is divorced from the imperative to care for oneself. And how can we hope to care for others, after all, if we ourselves are crippled by ill health, burnout, and resentment? And it goes on a little bit further down to say that if they are to heed the self-care imperative, medical academics must turn to an ethics that not only encourages, but even demands care of self. And it's that piece that I want us to focus on. Do you demand care for yourself? Do you put yourself at the top of the to-do list? Do you prioritize your needs such that when you put into yourself all of your ripple effects through your family, through your friends, your colleagues, your patient care, the research and the teaching that you do will get better if you focus and put yourself at the center of the to-do list or the top of the to-do list. So here's my little statement of trying to empower some healing through this time. Hopefully we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, but we do need to think about how we name things, how we claim it, and how we regain it. So first we have to name the challenges that we're facing. And if we're stressed and we're burnt out, we need to name that and understand where we are so we can move forward. Then we need to claim it, meaning we claim the power, the empowerment to do things about it, not just to sit in it, but to also move forward. So that part toward action. And then again, to regain it by taking control over what we have control over. We might not be able to change the whole world, but we do have the ability to change how we perceive things, how we respond to things, and how we want to have a mindset about things. So thinking about positive psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, and all those pieces that help us find happiness and joy in what we do in life What we have control over is the things that we can influence the quickest and the fastest. Now, I'm going to start with this statement, which is seek assistance, because it is only human for us to need help from other people. And of course, I put on here the top two most important ones. Women physicians tend to commit suicide 4 times more than male physicians. And through the pandemic, we also developed this physician access line. So people can have access to someone in a confidential and psychologically safe way. So seek assistance when needed. Help is out there and people are willing to help. If you are involved in an organization that has an institutional EAP program or employees assistance program or some sort of physician's wellness program, that might be another place to go. We have state physicians' health programs and the Federation of State Physicians' Health Programs, and health programs vary from one state to the other. So depending on your health program, if they're very focused on a wellness approach, then that might be a great place to use. But we also have a number of great resources through different medical organizations. The AMA is one of them, the American College of Physicians, and National Academies of Medicine also have really great resources on the internet, as does our Center for Professional Health at Vanderbilt. But don't forget that you can also access private counseling and professional coaching services. And with the COVID pandemic, using Zoom and things like that to reach people in various parts of the country has now opened up the option to have counseling and therapy and coaching services with someone in a state completely different from yours that doesn't have to always be during your business hours or your personal time. You get to choose. And then, of course, if you've used any substances in trying to cope or you're finding that you're not coping well, then getting into a treatment program or using other community-based programs can be helpful. So first and foremost, please remember, you're human. Seeking assistance doesn't make you weak or unimportant. It makes you someone who can benefit from the resources that are available. Now, again, thinking about healing and resilience in less than 20 minutes is hard to do. So I'm just going to cover a couple of things that are either in the individual and or the organizational side of things. So again, the first one is seek assistance, whether it's inside or outside your organization. Then that part about prioritizing your wellness, putting you at the top of the to-do list, starting with self-care, getting enough sleep, getting enough, good wholesome calories in there, getting physical activity, connecting in deep personal relationships, community, things like that, keeping a positive attitude and happiness, finding your meaning, purpose, and value, and using those things in a daily place. And most of that is under your control, but you have to feel empowered to get there. Then stress is inevitable pretty much for all of us, but there are some stresses that are preventable. And so what are your stress triggers? Do you know what they are? Do you know how to prevent them? Do you know how to manage your stress? And again, this is a great place for coaching and EAP programs to help guide you, or mentors to help give you skills that you can use in managing stress. Sean Archer talks about happiness and perceiving happiness, and that 90% of what we perceive from the external, we get to determine how we utilize it. And so if we do that and we look at things in a positive sense or in a way that we can learn from these lessons, then we're using our resilience to grow even in the challenging situations. And that's part of building resilience. Resilience is that piece of how do we adapt to and overcome the hardships and the challenges that come our way. By nature, humans are very resilient individuals. And pretty much because you've made it to this point in life, going through medical school and residency trainings, you're probably a very resilient individual. But there are things that you can do to continue to enhance that, because as the chronic stresses pile up on top, we need something in reserve. And so that's, again, self-care, managing energy, building your emotional intelligence, learning how to manage your stresses, and practicing some mindfulness-based stress reduction. And then speaking about managing energy, this starts to now overlap a lot between individual and organizational side of things. And so how do you manage your energy? Where do you put your energy? And I know for me, going through the pandemic, I got to a point about a year and a couple of months into the pandemic when I just felt kind of like I just couldn't multitask anymore. It seems harder to stay on Zoom. And so there are those places that I realized it was draining my energy and places where I wanted to put my energy, because putting my energy in the positive places builds my endorphins and helps increase my dopamine and keeps me in a happier place. So thinking about where those two fit and how you will use them either at work or home. And then keeping connected. Again, social connections are so important. So talking about the challenges you're facing with people who are comfortable in that space and who you can trust in a psychologically safe place is also very critical. And then we were already at high risks of burnout, and multiple sources of burnout exist in our organizations. And so thinking about what sources might be impacting you at this time and then trying to reduce them. And needless to say, there are so many areas in the organization where we need to address system issues. But what I remind everyone is that the system issues don't get better on their own. Individuals have to make those system sources come to light and find solutions for them. And so if you have energy to be one of those people to change systems, then look in your organization, whether it's even home life or work life, and find where those system sources exist and address those stresses and challenges. So here's a quote that we use in our center, which is, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. So hopefully you'll think about some empowerment and trying to do things a little bit differently for you. And then I'd like to end on a reflection of gratitude for each of you again. This is a poem by Jan Richardson called "Blessed Are You Who Bear the Light." And it reads, "Blessed are you who bear the light in unbearable times, who testify to its endurance amid the unendurable, who bear witness to its persistence even when everything seems in shadow and grief. Blessed are you in whom the light lives, in whom the brightness blazes, your heart a chapel, an altar where in the deepest night can be seen the fire that shines forth in you in unaccountable faith, in stubborn hope, in love that illuminates everything that is broken and that it finds." So I thank you for being the light for the last 2 years. I pray that you continue to be the light in the future. And so in summary, we move toward healing when we can face our most brutal realities and retain the hope that will prevail in the end. We need to name it, claim it, regain it, and then we need to be empowered to take action and make our changes that benefit us.
Thank you, Dr. Dewey, for a great presentation. And I'm going to hang on to that reclaiming piece of all of this really tightly. That was very beautiful. I always like to start with a quote because they're a way for me that helps me to center and ground in what I want to talk about. And this quote really always has stood out to me, that if we do not transform our pain, we most assuredly will transmit it. All suffering is potentially redemptive. All wounds are potentially sacred wounds. It just depends on what we do with them. And I love this so much because it really speaks to the truth that we are carrying wounds. And especially after the last couple of years, so many of us are carrying multiple sources of woundedness. One of the things that I hear most frequently, actually, is I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave this profession. I'm going to have to leave this profession that I love in order to survive. And Dr. Dewey actually put a poll up there, are you thriving? Are you surviving? And to hear so many women and men, our colleagues coming and saying, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave to live, is really heart-rending. And the hope, since Dr. Dewey ended with hope, is the hope is we don't. We actually don't have to leave to live. And we do have to tend to the things that will help us to thrive in and through and grow in and through the trauma of these times. And so I will only leave this slide up. I thought about skipping it, but we do such a great job of telling all the things we do. And sometimes we forget to talk about the people that we are. And so the most interesting things about me are not what I do. The most interesting things about me are that I'm a mom to 4 boys, and then I'm a small farmer. I live on a small farm in central Illinois, where I get to both take care of people and take care of all kinds of living things. And that has been a real source of joy and fun for me over the last couple of years. And so one of the things that we really, really focus on right now when we're talking about how we survive these times is stress. And I think that, like so many of you, it is probably the thing that I have heard the most over the last year. I'm so stressed out. I'm so stressed out. Can I get some help managing my stress? Institutionally, it is also the most frequent call I get is, from hospitals or other systems saying, my folks are stressed, our people are stressed, our doctors are stressed, our nurses are stressed. Would you please come in and talk to them about stress? And then my second least favorite thing at this point, come and talk to them about resilience. And I love resilience, don't misunderstand me. But too often, what we see when institutions start coming and saying, come and talk about resilience, is really what they're concerned with is, come and tell my people the things that they need to do in order to be more resilient so that I can extract more from them. And that actually isn't resilience. That's, in fact, what I like to call the weaponization of resilience. We are very, very, very resilient people. You would not have made it through undergraduate school and medical school and residency and the last couple of years if you were not a highly, highly resilient individual. What we lack are the things that we need in order to thrive. But stress itself, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with my screen right now. So there we go. Stress itself, though, gets a bad rap. We forget, I think, especially when we're faced with such unrelenting stress, we forget that actually stress and adversity are really important to our growth and our development. They build our courage and our resilience. We are resilient because we have faced and overcome stress and adversity over and over and over again. They are central to normal, healthy learning and development, both child development and adult development. This is critical to the stages of adult development that we're all going through. And then finally, stress increases our stress tolerance. The more stress I experience, the better able I am to manage stress going forward, if the right conditions are met. And that's an important thing. Even manageable, moderate, high stress can make us hardier and more adaptable, helps us to learn new skills and gain confidence. We become less fearful, and we can even begin to adopt a positive attitude about stress and stress mitigate with and for one another. Manageable, moderate, high stress also is a stretch and growth experience. This is really, really important because if we think that the goal is a stress-free life, we're shortchanging ourselves and we're shortchanging our children and we're shortchanging everyone around us. There is no way to reach a place where we have a stress-free life, and that should never be the ideal anyway. If that's the ideal, we are going to actually end up harming ourselves and our children, because children who don't face and overcome stress and adversity actually have a lot more struggles as young adults and in their adult lives. We need this in order to grow and to stretch. In other words, manageable stress is really good for us. And you're probably all noticing the key word there, right? Manageable. So what makes stress manageable? That's important. Well, previous exposure, right? What is manageable for me is much greater than what's manageable for my 18-year-old or my 11-year-olds, because I've been exposed to so much more stress. So my idea of manageable stress is much higher than theirs. My idea of manageable stress is higher than my medical students or my residents. Again, I've just been through I've lived a lot more decades. That's what I always tell them. It's not that I'm smarter than you. I've just lived longer than you have, right? I've been around longer. I've been exposed to more. How I have learned, what skills do I have for framing the stress? What's my mindset? What do I think about when I see stress? Am I able to notice it and frame or reframe it? Then this next one is really key. What kind of scaffolding do I have around me? External scaffolding, external support do I have that allows for the stress I'm experiencing, even high stress, even toxic stress, to be viewed as manageable versus unmanageable? That's really an important thing. And that has to do not only with what types of things exist in our communities, in our institutions, in our organizations, but also what kinds of connections have I built? How well supported am I socially? Do I have access to the resources I need? Critically important. And we all saw what happened at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, when not only did we not have the resources, but we couldn't access the few resources that did exist. PPE was in short supply. Ventilators were in short supply. Doctors and the things that we needed in order to do our job were in very short supply. What skills and techniques do I have that I have learned over my life? And are those accessible to me? Or am I so far underwater that I can't even access my internal resources anymore? And then finally, am I getting a break? Do I have time to rest and restore myself? Or am I so far underwater all the time that I'm just exhausted? And why this is important is because we understand now more than we have ever understood before that stress exists on a continuum with trauma. There is, in fact, a continuum from stress, good, healthy, helping us to grow, into the space of toxic stress, which harms us, in which we feel underwater all the time, in which we feel like it is inescapable, and then into this space of trauma, where the exposure has been so prolonged, where we do not have the type of scaffolding and supports around us that we need, particularly when it is compounded by a sense of inescapability and uncertainty, that it starts to harm rather than help our growth and development. Now, we've all probably been through periods of toxic stress before. I can say that there were periods of my residency that were toxic. There were periods of medical school that were toxic. There were periods of my young adult life that were toxic in the amount of stress I was exposed to. And there was a container around it. I knew how long it would last, or I had the right scaffolding and support, or I had the right connection. It didn't feel inescapable. When none of those conditions are met, though, what ends up happening is it becomes compounding. It is cumulative. It primes our system. It becomes embodied. It alters our sense of safety. It alters our sense of self. It alters our sense of security, and it harms and derails our growth and development. It becomes embodied as trauma. And this has been our lived experience for years. And for some who are probably in this room now, for many, 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 many years, even before COVID. Let us not forget that all of this did not begin in 2020. For many of this was ongoing long before COVID came along. And in fact, I've taken to calling the last few years of this unrelenting, cumulative, compounding toxic stress as the tridemic. It's COVID-19, yes. It's also violence. The violence of our rhetoric, the political violence, the sharp uptick and exposure of racial violence. And it has all been compounded by this isolation. And the isolation of the last 3 years, this separation from one another, matters a lot. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that has been such a compounding impact in all of this. And so many of you have probably seen this image this cartoon and this idea that we can be immersed, that we can be underwater for this long and not be affected by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. And so what I am saying here is sort of harkens back to something that we learned in our first year of pharmacology, right? The dose makes the poison. We all remember learning that even water, too much, too fast, too soon, too long, can kill us. Exposure matters. And so where stress and adversity build our courage and resilience, this chronic, unrelenting exposure becomes embodied as trauma, and the trauma sets us back. It sets us on our heels. It makes it harder for us to do our job. And so let's shift gears really quickly. I always like to pose this question, and I always love the series of answers I get, and you can just answer it in your own head because we don't have time to really do a Q&A. But why do we exist? That's my favorite question to ask people. Why do we exist? And the simple answer is we exist to stay alive. Now, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and the great spiritual leaders would probably argue with me about this. But the truth of the matter is that biologically, evolutionarily, we exist to stay alive and pass on our DNA. And so to do this, to help us in this pursuit of staying alive, we are hardwired for two very significant things. The first of which is threat detection. We are absolutely hardwired to detect threat. In fact, we have this exquisite threat detection system that is scanning the environment continuously, taking in millions and millions of bits of data and sorting it, processing it, and making split-second decisions about the degree of threat that we are facing moment to moment. And when that threat detection system discerns that the threat is high enough, it will send us down one of four primary pathways: fight, flight, freeze, and submit. Now, trauma primes this system. Chronic, unrelenting, toxic stress primes this threat detection system. It puts it on constant, continuous high alert. And so when we have this really high exposure to trauma, when we have this really high exposure to toxic stress, when we are exposed repeatedly to event after event after event of trauma and harm, when we are in environments that feel inescapable, unavoidable, where we have no control, this has a lasting effect. And the experience of this very much becomes embodied in exactly the same way that a traumatic event like an assault or a terrorist attack or an accident becomes embodied in us. In fact, Resmaa Menakem has this incredibly succinct and perfect way of describing trauma as anything that happens that is too much, too fast, too soon, too long, coupled with not enough of the things that we needed, not enough of what should have been happening that would have been resourcing. This comes from his book, My Grandmother's Hands. It is brilliant and beautiful, and I highly recommend everyone pick it up. So what are the things that make an event traumatic or an exposure traumatic? Well, first and foremost is a real or perceived loss of control. Anybody but me experienced some loss of control over the last year? My kids are home. That's loss of control. 4 children? I'm trying to homeschool 4 children. Listen, I do not want you to read to me until you are good at it, right? Homeschooling was not a good thing for me, on top of trying to work, on top of being frontline as a public health provider, on top of trying to help medical students navigate all of this, on top of having a husband who was very, very much frontline in the hospital. Real or perceived threat. We all had a lot of that, right? Both real threat, perceived threat, sense of overwhelm, intensity, lacking support and lacking accesses and lacking resources. I don't know about any of you. The last few years have altered my view of the world, who I am in the world, altered how I view others, people I thought I knew, and it becomes embodied. Sometimes just looking at these things, those images that I had on the screen a little earlier, they call something up. My heart starts to pound. I've seen those images hundreds of times now. My throat starts to close. The trauma becomes embodied because the dose makes the poison. Too much stress, unmitigated, unrelenting, becomes trauma. And we experience this in three different ways. We experience it primary. The trauma is happening to me. Absolutely. We can experience trauma that is happening to us. We also experience trauma secondarily. I am walking alongside those who are experiencing trauma. I am listening to and carrying their trauma with them. And then there is vicarious trauma. That is the trauma that we absorb through the stories, through the images, through the unrelenting toxic stress and trauma that is happening in the world around us. And here's the deal. I cannot tell the difference. Phenotypically, when it shows up, I cannot tell if what you have experienced is the result of primary, secondary, or vicarious trauma. It looks the same. Physically, it looks the same. Emotionally, it looks the same. It drives the same behaviors because chronic exposure sensitizes and primes this threat detection system. And here's the deal. Our brains do not differentiate. This is really important. Our brains do not differentiate between physical threat and social threat. It reads it the same way. It activates the same pathway. By the way, you'll notice I do not use the word triggers. I use the word activates. There are two reasons for that seem valuable to draw attention to. One is that activate is a much more accurate descriptor of what is happening to us. When I am activated, it's my body that's coming online. It's the system that's coming online. It's being activated to respond to threat, real, perceived, social, physical. It's being activated to respond. The second reason is triggered has some really violent connotations that I don't like to bring into the room. And the third is the word has sort of been hijacked and used as a punchline. And I don't appreciate that either. Because we're talking about very real things. You know, trauma is not what happens to us. Trauma is what happens inside of us as a result of the experiences that we've had. And so trauma can absolutely result of abuse and neglect and loss. We also are experiencing global and national and community traumas, systemic traumas in our institutions, in our educational system, in our neighborhoods. We have systemic traumas that have been codified. And then there are these epigenetic traumas that we carry on in our DNA from our ancestors. And so how common is trauma? What's the penetrance? It's 100%. And so you remember that when we first started talking, I said that we are hardwired for two things. The first is threat detection. We are absolutely hardwired for threat detection. And we do not differentiate between physical threat and social threat. The second thing we're going to talk about that we're hardwired for really also comes back to evolution. So years and years ago, Margaret Mead, who's a famous cultural anthropologist, was asked, what do you think is the first evidence of the emergence of civilization in the world? Thinking that, you know, there might be an answer for this, like stone tools or clay pots or religious artifacts. And she said it was none of those things. In fact, what she brought forward and said was, oh, I know exactly what it was. It was the discovery of a 17,000-year-old fractured femur at an archaeological dig. And she said, the reason this is viewed as the emergence of civilization is that this femur bone wasn't just broken, it was healed in this ancestor's lifetime. A fractured femur, even with all of our, best medical care, is something that takes 8, 10, 12 weeks to fully begin to heal and get you back up and out there doing things. 17,000 years ago, you break your femur, your dinner for a saber-toothed tiger that night, right? You can't hunt, you can't collect water. You can't defend yourself. The fact that this bone had been broken and healed was evidence that someone had taken the time to stay with the injured, to tend to them, to feed them, to wait for them to become okay. It is our first evidence that we understood that we are safer in community. And this is why we read social threat using the same pathway as we read physical threat. It's why our threat detection system is equally activated and equally responsive, reactive to both of those things. Because to be thrown out of community is just as dangerous as encountering an apex predator in the wild. To be thrown out of tribe is to die. That is our hardwiring. But it also hardwires us for the solution. The solution is that we are hardwired for connection. We are hardwired to connect with one another. And that's why that third piece of the tridemic, remember we talked about COVID and we talked about the violence. The third piece of what has been so harmful has been this disconnection we've had from each other, this social isolation from one another. Because what we know, what we understand is that connection mitigates trauma. Connection disrupts that stress trauma continuum. Before even toxic stress becomes embodied as trauma, it disrupts it for us. Absent that connection, though, what's the disruptor? They cease to exist. Now, the problem is, of course, that the activation of our trauma can be very confusing. It doesn't show up looking exactly like we think it's going to. It shows up instead looking like aggression. It shows up looking like apathy. It can show up looking like avoidance. We can give it a lot of other names too. Exhaustion, inability to do our job, hopelessness and helplessness. This shows up looking like a lot of things that may or may not make sense in the context of the situation, especially when it's anger. My husband came home, I don't know, 6-8 months ago. I sometimes hesitate to tell this story because I don't look good in this story. But it was the end of many, many, many weeks of very, very high exposure to very toxic stress. He came home, I was out doing some chores, and he wandered up to me and he asked me, as he's asked me 100 times in our life, what's for dinner? And I blew up. I blew up. I completely lost all sense of self and all sense of context. It was a much greater reaction than the situation requires. It was frightening and confusing. It was very difficult to interrupt or interpret. These things don't respond to the usual interventions. And the reason is that once our threat detection is activated, social threat is activated, physical threat is activated, our decision making, our capacity for that prefrontal cortex to decide what's going to happen next goes offline. And because hurt people, it is really important that we be in choice in those moments when we encounter what we think is the discharge, that we decide, what do I need to do? How can I amplify? How can I disrupt this rather than amplify it? How do I mitigate this? Because this is where we have the opportunity to disrupt this continuum from stress to trauma. And we do this through what I sometimes call this path of becoming. You know, we talk about becoming anti-racist. We talk about how that is, there's no finish line to the work of anti-oppression. The same is true when it comes to becoming trauma-informed, knowing and understanding that trauma is ubiquitous, and becoming trauma-sensitive, noticing it and becoming aware of when it calls up in us and when it's being called up in others. And then finally, becoming responsive and mitigating to it when it shows up, rather than responding in a way that amplifies the trauma in ourselves and in others. We do this when we create a container through curiosity, the restoration of agency. If all trauma involves a loss of control, All trauma mitigation includes the restoration of agency, recognition of each other's humanity. When we seek to connect and hold space, when we seek to understand and utilize empathy and compassion, and of course, when we do no harm, because we are hardwired for connection. And the beautiful thing in this is that connection mitigates trauma bi-directionally. And so I'll just end with this idea that our brokenness does not diminish our brilliance, and our shadows do not extinguish our light. And the pain we are experiencing is not pathology. It is, in fact,
Thank you so much, both of you guys. Thank you, Drs. Dewey and Dr. Sarraf, for your amazing presentations. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We do have a couple minutes for discussion, and I will jump right into it. So the first question is for Dr. Dewey, and it says, how do you become empowered if and when it is a systems issue that we are unable to address, like administrations continuing to add more and more tasks to the remaining people when others quit?
Okay, so thank you for that question. It's one that I hear a lot. And sometimes I think it's one when people are starting to get into that hopeless phase, like they can't really see answers out. So when we think about being empowered and think about what our choices are, what our control is, there are some things we don't control, and we have to either accept that and then think about how we create movements to get those things changed. What are the direct reports, the way, the process of addressing change in organizations? Because that's, I think, what this question is asking, right? But we also have choice that I say is sometimes the basic choice. Is this a place where I stay, or is this a place where I go? And then if I stay at this place, because it's complicated, right? Kids might be in school, spouses might have jobs, okay? There's a lot of things that go into the decision-making process of whether someone leaves or stays in a certain position or organization. And if in the end, when I coach people through this process, most of the time they find that they really like their place or the people they're working with and want to actually stay. But there are few that decide it's not the best place for them and they move on. But in that piece, then it's that part of, if you stay, then how does change happen in your organization? We have a saying that systems resist change. So you have to go in understanding that there's a process. And it's not an overnight process, and it's a long-term process. And Christina Maslach talks about this a lot in her work on burnout and organizational changes to address sources of burnout, and that it's not going to be an individual, nor will it be an overnight kind of fix. It's a movement that needs to be created within the organization, and there's a whole bunch of business models and theories around this of how to do it. But if you're an individual that's in an organization that really feels that there's a place for change, find where that change is and then start working through the process of organization change to get them there. But it's not an easy fix. It's not something that I can simplify down into one answer to that question.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dewey. The next question I'll pose to both of you guys, and are you lady doctors? And it says, during the pandemic, many physicians had to make decisions that conflicted with their professional and/or personal values. So, we had to figure out who we were going to triage first and who got a vent and who didn't. What advice would you share with someone who is dealing with moral injury?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it starts with talking about it. It starts with connecting with others who have been through similar experiences. The stories we tell ourselves can be very, very dangerous. There's a great TED Talk out there about the danger of a single story. And it's really talking about a single story when it comes to race and racism. But I think that there is also some expansion of that we can bring into every story that we tell ourselves. Typically, my story is incomplete, but one of the most common stories that, or one of the most common themes that I notice is the story, I'm the only one. I'm the only one who. I'm the only one who couldn't handle it. I'm the only one who feels this way. I'm the only one who, ... Put whatever you want to at the end of those drama dots. And even though we may intellectually know I'm not the only one, or we may think, oh yeah, I read that other people are going through this, there is something about the act of connecting with somebody who looks at you in the eye and says, oh yeah, I understand what that feels like. I know what you're talking about. You're not the only one. You're not crazy. You know, you're not experiencing or feeling something that other people aren't experiencing or feeling. You have a right to feel this way about it. It's really, really powerful. And I really am a huge, huge proponent of therapy. Doctors have been resistant to seeking the help that they need from therapists for a lot of reasons, real and perceived threat to licensure and social status, and culturally, we have all kinds of stigma built around it. Let me tell you something. There's nothing better than good therapy. If you're not in a place where you want good or feel like you can seek good therapy, or you can't get to a therapist, find a good coach as a bridge to good therapy. Find a good friend as a bridge to good therapy. We can do all of these things simultaneously, and none of us are alone. I don't care how deep, dark, ugly the thoughts in the head may be. You are not alone in them.
I thank you for that. I mean, I was shocked. I know that Dr. Dewey mentioned that women physicians are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than our male physician counterparts, although men in general have a much higher suicide success rate than we do. That's something eye-opening that we really don't think about. We just sort of keep going, and then you look up and we're like overstressed. So I know that both of you guys have hit on, stress and trauma and self-care. What advice would you give to women physicians in terms of how to practice self-care? I mean, we say practice self-care, but what does that mean to each of you?
For me, it's definitely, as I say, prioritizing yourself to the top of the list. We do an exercise in our women's workshops and retreats that focus on finding their meaning, purpose, and value, and then making sure they're living that meaning, purpose, and value. And so whatever that is to you, and to understand that there's flexibility in it. And what I do for physical activity now, I did not do in the same way when I had very young children that were stroller ages, right? So it's having that flexibility to adjust and to say, for me, right here, right now, this is how I take care of myself first. This is how I put me at the top of the to-do list. I think everybody has different aspects of what they think self-care means to them, but I do address it in the mental, emotional, the physical, and the spiritual realms to make up one whole human being.
Yeah, I love that. Self-care is a very unbeautiful thing also. We sometimes think of it as a pedicure, massage, all of which I love. I mean, don't get me wrong. Those are treats. Those are not self-care. Self-care is getting enough sleep. Self-care is saying, I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me. Everybody practice with me now. I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me. It's a gentler way of saying no, because a lot of us have a really hard time saying, no, I won't do that. I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me. That's also self-care.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with both of those comments. Setting boundaries and knowing what what your boundaries are and how far you can be stretched and things you can and can't do, and being honest with yourself about what you can't do so that you don't feel stressed out is definitely a way to practice self-care. I think we're running out of time, so I know that there will be other people that have questions. If you ladies want to share how people can reach out to you or follow you on social media or anything you guys have coming up in terms of events, that would be great.
So we have our women's retreat coming up in April through the Center for Professional Health. It's a 3-day process, and we say you can take 3 days to prioritize yourself. And so if you look us up at if you just Google Center for Professional Health, Vanderbilt University Medical Center, or Google me, you'll find it. And that's one coming up. We also have a leadership training program on how to get leaders in a place, one, where they take care of themselves, 2, they recognize the stresses and sources of burnout in their organizations, and then 3, they develop plans to overcome those sources within their organizations. And that one is in July. And we have other materials and options available on our webpage as well.
Really want to thank Dr. Dewey, Dr. Soroff for your wisdom and a very informative presentation today. Really want to encourage everyone to fill out the survey that's in the links. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Dewey and Sarraf for all of the information on well-being, increasing empathy, mitigating trauma. Your wisdom today is greatly appreciated. We thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us and share your presentations. Everyone, have a wonderful day.